Welcome to Arts and Humanities Are Central. I'm Margie Morgan, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and your host for this exploration of the important role that the arts and humanities play in our everyday lives. My guest today is Professor Lisa Norris, who's a faculty member in the Department of English. She's been at Central since 2007, teaching in our writing specialization major. Lisa, welcome. Thanks for being with us
Thanks for having me
today. Before we talk about your latest book, let's establish some facts about your educational and your work backgrounds. So first of all, what did you get your undergraduate degree in?
My undergraduate degree is a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife from Virginia Tech.
Wow. And at the time that you graduated, what were your career goals?
I was thinking that I would be Jane Goodall. That was one ambition I had. Or, you know, you never quite know sometimes as an undergrad, but I thought I might be a nature writer. But I thought in order to be a nature writer, you would first have to get your degree or have to understand science. And I thought science was much harder to understand in my mind then than literature and writing, which anyone could do. Anyone could read and write.
So what kind of work did you do after college?
During college, I had a co-op job at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And also I had jobs working for the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. At one point I was a fire dispatcher in Wyoming for the Bureau of Land Management. But then pretty directly after I got my Bachelor of Science, I went on for a Master of Arts in English and then eventually for the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing.
So you went from forestry and science and wildlife into English and into writing.
Correct.
So you've had a really diverse educational background and work background, maybe much more diverse than the typical English or writing major.
Well, I'm not sure about writers. I think quite a few writers do a bunch of different things. But obviously most of my life has been teaching.
And your writing as well is very diverse, it seems to me. You write in a number of different genres, is that right?
That's right.
Which just for example, what kinds of writing do you do?
Well, I do poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. And I think of myself mostly as a prose writer. I've published most in fiction, but I've also published in both creative nonfiction and poetry. Poetry is the genre that's most fun sometimes because I don't expect anything of myself in poetry.
But maybe you're most comfortable with which genre? Maybe creative nonfiction?
Probably either fiction or creative nonfiction. It's kind of a toss-up between those two.
Now you've written two books. Both are collections of short stories. The first book is Toy Guns. It was published in 2000. And your latest book is Women Who Sleep with Animals, published in 2011. So before we talk about the book, the most recent book, let's talk about the process of publishing a book, which I find interesting. A book of stories, it's very different from publishing a history book, which of course is my field. So these individual stories, before they ever get in a book, where do they appear?
They usually appear in literary magazines, often published by university presses. So, for example, the Georgia Review is one of the premier university press literary magazines. And some of the stories I've published first were in Notre Dame Review or South Dakota Review, Ascent, lots of different.
So you publish these individual stories in these literary magazines, and then how do you decide to put a bunch of stories together?
Well, in the first case, in the case of my first book, Toy Guns, it was a matter of just being a beginning writer and just writing what came to mind, and then looking at what I'd already written and saying to myself, where's the pattern here? Are there stories that would belong together in a group? And I was sort of surprised to discover that how much I was writing about violence. At least 6 of the stories in Toy Guns have guns in them. And so I put those stories together, and as well as others that had violent themes about violence, mostly about the ill consequences of violence, both immediately and later. And then those ended up being the collection Toy Guns.
And then the second book?
The second book was, I had a group of women friends at the time I noticed who were all sleeping with animals, even if they, non-human animals,
non-human animals.
even if they had partners, they were sleeping with animals.
Right.
So I thought it would be fun to write a story around women, a collection around women and animals. And as it turns out, you know, I was thinking of women and men too as animals. And in some of the stories, I'm exploring the non-human nature. I mean, the animal nature of humans. Animals.
Right. Right. So this second book focuses more on relationships and
on relationships, our biological selves. I think of it exploring that aspect of humanity.
Right. So you find you have a pattern, there's a theme, and you put the stories together into a manuscript, and then what happens?
Then you send them off to, there are some options. One option is to do what I did, which is to bundle them off and send them off to contests, which are usually run by small presses. And the contest fees help fund the publication of the book. So there are usually several hundred manuscripts and judges or a panel of judges who select the manuscripts. In another case, you could try to publish short stories via a literary agent and the New York presses. But short stories don't sell very well, and agents usually don't want to handle them. So I didn't even try that.
But what you did, it seems to me, is extremely impressive. You sent both of your manuscripts to contests, to press contests, and the result of those contests is your book was chosen and published.
It was exciting.
It was very exciting. So you won a prize for both of these books. And the prize enabled your book to be published, correct?
Correct.
So what prizes did you win for these books?
Well, for Toy Guns, it's a prize called the Willa Cather Fiction Prize. Helicon 9 Press sponsored that one. And for Women Who Sleep with Animals, it's Stephen F. Austin State University Press, which ran a contest and then published the book.
Great. Well, let's talk about the writing process itself. This fascinating. I love to hear writers talk about how they write. So, first of all, I mean, can you write anywhere, any place?
Virginia Woolf said that in order to write well, in order to be Shakespeare, the women needed a room of one's own and an income. And I think by a room of one's own, what she meant was a room free of domestic responsibilities. So what I have now is a house like that, because
a house of your own.
I have a house of my own. I'm single now. My son is grown. And so I can write anywhere in that house.
And that's where you prefer, in your house?
I prefer in my house, but I can also write in coffee shops or on airplanes. Or it's easier to write if there's not someone nearby for whom I feel responsible. So it's easier to write either alone or in a place where you're surrounded by strangers.
Right. I had a friend, a writer at my previous institution, and he always wrote in Denny's, the Denny's coffee, the little small town Denny's coffee shop. He just wanted noise and buzz about him, you know, when he was writing. Well, do you tend to write in sporadic bursts of creativity, or are you very methodical about your writing and discipline? Like, okay, I am going to write 3 pages a day, or 25 a month, or how do you work?
Well, I'm not methodical about much of anything, but I resist methodical. But I do write at least in a journal every day, and other than that, but if I'm working on a story or an essay or a poem, I typically will write when I'm not grading papers. So often I arrange my writing time around when the papers need to be graded. So it's holiday breaks, or a week when nothing is due, or summertime.
Well, you must be looking forward to your sabbatical where you won't have any papers to grade for a year. And you can write.
It's unimaginable right now.
So do you start with characters, like you have characters in your mind and you let the story unfold, or do you start with a concept or a question and create characters around them? I mean, how's your process? How's your conceptual process?
Well, it varies. With Women Who Sleep with Animals, the first story in the book is called Dark Matter, and I set out to write that story by challenging myself. I said, you hardly ever write anything funny, so why don't you write something funny?
So you started with that, okay.
Yeah.
And then it unfolded from there.
Right.
Okay. And sometimes, I think you said to me once that setting was setting is very important.
Setting is very important.
That.
And for example, in The Lookout, a story called The Lookout, I had visited a fire lookout tower in Idaho, and I found it to be a very interesting experience where my imagination was engaged. And so I just thought, I'm going to set a story in the lookout tower.
What kinds of settings are inspiring to you?
Usually small towns or rural landscapes or wilderness. I'm not much of I don't have that much experience in cities. And they make me kind of uncomfortable, but maybe I should set that as a challenge for next year.
Maybe to be funny in a city.
There we go.
Are other writers important to your writing process?
Completely, totally.
So this is not an isolated thing for you.
Well, it's interesting because you obviously write in isolation, but when you're writing, you're always aware of those you've read. And so those voices are constantly going. So my literary forebears are present. And certainly Flannery O'Connor, Raymond Carver, Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, and Joyce Carol Oates have been formative influences, and Ed Falco. And then I have contemporaries, people who are near and dear.
Writing groups.
Right. And friends.
So let's focus on your latest book now, Women Who Sleep with Animals. I love this title. I've loved it since I first heard it. And in this book...
I appreciate that.
I do. Oh, it's a great title. It's a great title. A book in which you explore relationships between humans and other humans as animals, but also between humans and other animals. It seems to me that these stories reflect a knowledge about a lot of other things besides just relationships. Oil spills, how to slit an animal's throat, lab research, bears in their dens. So do you do research in order to write these stories, or are most of your stories based on your actual own first-hand experiences?
A combination. Speaking of the throat slitting, for example, there's a story in which there's a road-killed deer. Well, he's not dead yet and needs to be helped out of its suffering. And I've never slit a deer's throat, but I have seen a person do it, but I didn't know how it would feel. So I ended up emailing my hunter friends and asking them specific questions about how that would feel and whether you could do it and exactly how would you do it. And so that helped me to write that scene.
So it's a kind of a combination of research and asking others and your own experience.
Right.
And your characters, are they mostly fiction or
they're a kind of collage.
Are they part you, part friends?
I'm sure they're always part me. But they're a kind of collage. For instance, there's a character, I think his name is Lenny in Swimmers, who's the young lover of the protagonist. And there's a rather famous picture of an Arabian woman, actually, who has really light blue eyes. You may remember seeing it. And I looked at her face, and I thought, what would that face be like if it was male and on a man's body? Because those light blue eyes really struck me. And then I imagined then I made up a bunch of stuff for that character.
One of the stories that really resonated with me is the one called The Lookout. Could you just summarize very briefly for us the story?
In The Lookout, there is a married couple. It's a second marriage, and they have very different interests. They want to go, he's urban and artistic, scholarly, and wants to go to Europe for a summer vacation. And she is very outdoorsy, and her first marriage was out in the West. So they decide to take summer vacations separately for the first time, and she travels out to Idaho and goes to a lookout tower as part of her experience, where she encounters temptation.
Yes, yes. That story to me seems to ask a fundamental question about relationships that is very interesting to me, and that is, what do two people need to share in order for the relationship to work? Or another way, I guess, to ask the question is, how much independence can two people have and a relationship still work well? So what does your story say about this question, do you think?
I'm not sure I imagined the question quite that way, but I can see how the story would bring that question up. For me, as I reread the story and rethink it especially, and it seems to me that there are unresolved issues, and that the protagonist has to go back to a point of where there's unresolved issues from her previous marriage. And she's unable to express, she's unable to express who she is in this urban environment. She feels not at home there. So part of it is, where can she express who she is? And she feels like she has to go out west in order to do that. And I guess he feels the same. I mean, we don't know that much about the other character, but he feels he can't quite express who he is. So, and to do so, he needs to go to the place where he's comfortable, or where his passions are.
So one of the things you're saying is, at least in this story, and I think probably in some of your other stories too, that the past, one's past, you're exploring in some ways how the past really influences people's struggles and actions in the present.
Completely.
That's a real theme for you?
Definitely, definitely. Yes, and every fiction writer has to deal with that, because it's not, a story isn't all that interesting if you don't know the backstory of the character. That is, if you just watched what I do, you don't know anything about who I am. You've got to know what I've already done, what makes me me, how is my identity composed. And it's composed of what I do now, and also what motivates me to do what I do now.
So your stories also seem to challenge some stereotypes about men and women. The stereotype being it's men who typically stray in a relationship, men who are more obsessed with sex than women. This doesn't seem to be the case in your stories.
Well, I think that people in general often they feel their value depending on who finds them valuable. And for women, unfortunately, in many ways, our value has been felt in terms of our sexual value. So I think women are, in the stories, some of the women are still trying to find their value in that way. But I think that what they really want is connection. What they really want is real human connection and love. So, but the women in the stories they act on their desires. I think that's part of what you're talking about. Maybe that's the way that it challenges the stereotype. And maybe they're not waiting to be chased. They're
maybe that's the animal.
Reaching out.
You're looking at the animal and the human, and so focusing more on just some raw desires.
And I wonder too. Many of the characters are older, right? They're not younger women, and so as women get older, I think they're willing to act on what they want. They're willing to reach out.
You also seem rather positive rather than pessimistic about relationships, it seems to me. I'm thinking of the opening story maybe, in particular, others too, but Dark Matter, I think, is a good example of a positive attitude. Can you summarize that story briefly for us?
Dark Matter, I'm not sure I can summarize that story, but well, in Dark Matter there's a couple who's having some sexual problems, I'll just say it that way. And in working through the sexual problems, you discover that they both essentially have a fear of death. And Dark Matter becomes, it's about the physical, in the physics sense, dark matter is supposedly what holds together the universe. And it also becomes a metaphor for a woman's womb. And so I'm kind of playing with those two ideas together and talking about the dark, looking for ways that these two people can find the glue that holds them together. Again,
because they seem to have lost that glue. They're just going through routine, they're not really communicating. And
true. And they're afraid, especially the husband is very afraid because he's sort of trapped in his suburban existence.
But oftentimes, couples separate under these circumstances, and here these two are committed to renewal and to really working on the relation. There's a real upbeat, positive view.
Well, I was working very hard in this book to try to bring characters together, because I noticed that in Toy Guns, characters are isolated and driven apart by violence, and so I was reacting in part to my previous book.
That's very interesting. So your first book can actually have an effect on what you do in your second book.
Oh, definitely.
Talk a
Definitely.
little bit about that.
Well, Toy Guns, I was never super comfortable representing toy guns. I feel that Toy Guns tells truths as I saw them then, but I think it does so sometimes in a heavy-handed way. And there were people who said to me after Toy Guns, "I can't believe a nice woman like you wrote a book like that." and so it was kind of hard for me to represent, although I think part of that was just being a young writer, not comfortable representing anything. But I thought a lot about the writing of violence. There are ways, you've got to be able to do it in such a way that it doesn't perpetuate violence. You want to show the ill effects of violence, and of course Toy Guns tries to do that, but I'm not yet Raymond Carver, Flannery O'Connor, or any of my heroes or heroines, so I don't know how well I pulled it off. But at any rate, after the book Toy Guns, I thought I really want to write a positive book, a book that I can be comfortable representing, and a fun book, a book that's a little more fun. So that, in part, was what led to the next book.
And so, has Women Who Sleep with Animals, is that leading to a next book?
It is, because now I think I've been too light. And I just read A Handmaid's Tale again.
Oh yes,
and my students were wonderfully inspired by it, as was I. It's a rich book in many ways, and Margaret Atwood is a wonderful model of a writer who can represent disturbing ideas powerfully. She's unafraid.
Yes.
That is a woman who is unafraid. So it seems.
And you don't want to make her angry. I've seen her. I thought, I don't want to be on this woman's bad side.
I can imagine. You know, she had a forebear who was actually hanged as a witch and survived the hanging. It was a slow hanging. She survived the hanging and lived for 14 more years after that.
Wow. Communication seems to be another issue in your stories. What are some communication issues that you explore in these stories?
Well, I think people often don't say things. They are silent in order to protect other people and themselves. So, for example, there's a story called Please Use the Password, which is set in the Kittitas Valley, I'm proud to say. And in that story, one character thinks she has cancer. It's pretty sure she has cancer and doesn't want to tell the other guy, and her partner has been in the Vietnam War and doesn't want to talk about that. So they're both protecting themselves and each other, and it leads to some difficulties in communicating. This isn't until they start to talk to each other about the hard stuff that they really begin to come together.
Right. I think what I got from that story, a lot of times you think that by not talking about something, that will be beneficial and helpful.
Right.
Not, it'll go away. Maybe, I guess people think maybe it'll go away, but in fact, it just gets worse and festers, and this seems to be what happens there.
It does.
And
timing, of course, is very important.
When to talk about these
right.
things, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What do your stories say about our relationship with non-human animals?
I think they're mirrors in many ways. The way we treat each other is, the way we treat animals is kind of a mirror of how we feel about ourselves. So in the story, the swimmers, the biologists they're using animals, research animals. They're having to, quote unquote, sacrifice animals, and it leads to a kind of detachment that the protagonist feels in her human relationships as well.
Yes, that was very powerful. What was happening with the animals and the research and the sacrifice there was precisely what was happening in her affairs that were like, she was like sacrificing the lovers at the end.
Exactly.
They were mirror stories. It was
right.
amazing. And so, yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for reading it so carefully.
Well, I love these stories. I want to say to everyone watching that this is a fabulous book, and Women Who Sleep with Animals, I encourage everyone to read these stories. It's very interesting.
Thank you,
reading groups out there would do well to read these stories. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Sure. First of all, make sure you actually have to be a writer, because there are professions that you might also do that might bring just as much satisfaction. But I don't think that people keep being writers unless they just have to write.
Right.
So
you feel compelled internally. This comes from inside.
Right,
You've got to do it.
You have to get it out. That's kind of what it is. Or you don't even know what you think until you see what you say. So I would say that people who want to try to publish should simply keep writing, read, and revise. Be open to your writers group, your trusted readers' criticisms. Writing groups have been very, very important for me. There's a writing group in Idaho that I meet with annually called the Free Range Writers. And they include, well, when we first started, none of us had published a book. And now I think we just counted up something like honestly, it's something like 16, 17, 18 books between the five of us.
Wow, that's impressive.
I know.
That's great.
I gave Kim Barnes and Buddy Levy are our two most prolific writers, Jane Varley also, and Colin Hughes. We meet in a rustic cabin in northern Idaho, and we just read and write for 3 days.
Well, you know, you think of the image of the writer is like in a rustic cabin alone, but in fact, you know, what you're saying is that also this community of writers is very important. You need feedback, you need to share, and yeah, you need that alone time maybe in the rustic cabin, but you also need to come together.
Definitely.
With other writers.
Yeah, I think that community of support has been really important for me, and especially important if you want to publish, because the people who you start out with writing who haven't published end up being the people who help you find editors and publishers later.
And I know you're working with our students in the same way. I see a lot of workshopping of writing going on. And
definitely.
Communities of writers among our students, and that's just great. They're getting that same experience.
We have some wonderfully talented writers here among the students. Just read a couple of fabulous master's theses.
Great. Well, Lisa, thank you for being with us today. I think we're just about out of time. And again, I want to encourage everyone to read Women Who Sleep with Animals. Thanks for being with us, and thank you for tuning in to Arts and Humanities Are Central. See you next time.
Thank you. When the phone rang, I ran into the laundry room, where the old brown rotary model hung. It was a totem of misfortune from my first marriage, the final straw being Chuck's call from the police station after his second DUI. This was a different kind of call. Diane, it's me. Kay? It's me, Kay said again. I've hit a deer. What? I said, not because I didn't hear her, but because I didn't understand. How could she hit a deer next door? After 3 years of friendship, I knew her routines. She was usually in her studio between 8 and noon, not answering her telephone or allowing interruptions. Me, I was nothing but interruptible. If it wasn't my daughter, Chloe, who needed me, it was my second husband, Tom, the volunteers at the animal shelter I managed, or the peace group that had become more active since George W. Bush had squared off with Iraq. Listening to static and a brief delay after Kay identified herself, this told me she was on her cell. I hit a deer, she said again. I looked at the canned goods lined up on the basement shelves, suppressing an urge to move a jar of applesauce that had somehow invaded the green beans. On Payback Mountain Road, Kay said, the deer is hurt. I think it's hurt badly. What about you? I think I'm okay. You think? Shaken up. What about the car? It still runs. Why are you out there? Payback Mountain was only a few miles out of town, but we'd had some snow and then a covering of ice that hadn't yet melted. Beautiful, encasing the living stems and branches of trees in ways I'd been trying to paint when Kay called. It had been hard-won, that basement studio space, and the few hours for myself on Saturday morning. It had involved tears, a yard sale, a rearrangement of Chloe's visitation schedule with her father, and an expenditure of money I didn't have for art supplies. This deer, she said, it's not dead. You're the Humane Society. I thought you'd know what to do.